Thank you all for joining us today. We'll just wait a few more seconds whilst we wait for everyone who is in the waiting room to trickle in. But thank you all for joining us from different parts of the world. I can see some familiar names. So we'll just give this a few more seconds. Okay. I think everyone from the waiting room is now in, so we can now start. So hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. So this webinar is coordinated by the Bioethics Interest Group here at the George Washington University, and it's coordinated by the Office of Research Excellence, and it's also a collaboration with our research ethics capacity building initiatives in Pakistani, Zimbabwe, and in Mali. I am happy to say that some of our colleagues from those countries are also with us today. So thank you and welcome to this webinar today, focusing on why study religion and spirituality in bioethics. And today we've got two great speakers. But before I introduce those two wonderful speakers, let me just inform you about how we are going to run this webinar. So I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and then once they've presented, we're going to then go through a Q&A session, which is going to be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Melissa Goldstein. So our panelists today are Dr. Irene O and also Dr. Lori Zoloth. So let me say a bit more about our two presenters. So Dr. Irene O is an associate professor and chairperson of the Department of World Religions in the Department of World Religions in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences here at the George Washington University. And Dr. Irene teaches some courses in religious ethics and also serves, of course, as the chair of the Department of World Religions. And from 2009 to 2020, she directed the Peace Studies program and currently co-edits the Journal of Religious Ethics. She is the author of The Rights of God, Islam, Human Rights, and Comparative Ethics, which was published in 2007. And she has been elected to the board of the Society of Christian Ethics and is also a founding member of the Society for the Study of Muslim Ethics. She is actually involved in lots of other positions. Thank you so much, Irene, for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your views on this interesting topic. And our second panelist is going to be Dr. Lori Zoloth. So let me say that I have worked with Lori for more than 8 years. We have been working together as part of the Ethics Advisory Committee for the Target Malaria program. So she is within the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, and she is the Margaret Bertrand Professor of Religion and Ethics. She's also part of the program in Jewish Studies and the McLean Center for Biomedical Ethics at the Pritzker School of Medicine. So she is definitely a leader in the field of religious studies with particular scholarly interest in bioethics and Jewish studies. She explores the linkage between religion and ethics, drawing from various sources. She has written a lot on genetic engineering, gene drive, stem cell research, and all that. And she has written 4 books, one on healthcare and ethics, the other one on Jewish bioethics, another one on Jewish thought and global warming, and recently a book on gene drives, malaria, and the future of nature. And she has also co-edited 6 books that deal with so many topics. So this is wonderful. So today we're going to hear from our two panelists. So to you, all the participants, let me encourage you to submit your comments and questions through the Q&A function. Once the panelists are done with their presentations, we're going to go through a session to focus on the questions. Let me take this opportunity to thank all those participants who sent in their questions. We're going to address them as we proceed with this session. And with that, let me now hand over to Irene. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It is a really wonderful opportunity to work across divisions at the George Washington University. And also thank you to Lori Zoloth, who really is a leader in the field and someone I have known through her wonderful work and reputation in the field of religious ethics. So let me begin by sharing with you some slides. And if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat. Okay, here we go. All right. All right. Can everyone see this? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so the question that heads this webinar is, what is the role or why is it so important to study religion and spirituality in bioethics or biomedical ethics? And one thing I want to make clear is that when we are talking about religion and spirituality and biomedical ethics, we are talking about these how these worldviews and lifestyles and beliefs affect not just the patient, but also have an effect on the way in which a physician or healthcare worker might approach this field, but also healthcare institutions themselves, family and communities, states and governments, as well as a larger culture. So, one way in which we might be able to organize our thoughts and questions is, when we speak about religion and spirituality, uh, are we talking about its influence overall, or are we talking about its influence with regard to one of these sectors? And this is a type of Venn diagram where a lot of these spheres actually overlap with one another. So you can imagine, for example, how a state or government that is influenced by a particular set of religious beliefs might have an impact on the way in which healthcare institutions run, might have an impact not just on the patient, but also physicians, as well as have an impact on the larger culture. I did have a look at a number of the questions that people had submitted to the bioethics interest group, and a number of the questions were asking about the distinction between religion and spirituality. I want to make clear that there is no single set definition of religion and no single set definition of spirituality. That being said, um, in general, religion tends to have a more quote unquote official status. We have distinct religious traditions, for example, that are going to be categories on surveys. So people might be asked on a survey, are you Christian? Are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Do you identify with Buddhism? And you might even have subsets where if you identify as Christian, for example, you might be asked what subset of Christianity to which you belong. Spirituality, on the other hand, tends not to be recognized in these official categories nearly as often as religion. Also, people oftentimes believe that spirituality is something that is separate from religion. However, it is important to note that a lot of spiritual practices actually have religious roots. And my colleague Liz Bucar at Northeastern University actually has a book coming out very soon about the religious roots of spiritual practices. So that might be of interest to some people in our audience. Another distinction that people might make between religion and spirituality is oftentimes spirituality is considered to be an individualized practice. So one might consider, for example, meditation to be something that is done in the comfort of and the privacy of one's home. Um, However, this is not always the case. Some people might engage in yoga not just as a form of exercise, but as a form of spiritual practice, and that is oftentimes done in a group. It's important, I think, also to think about the historical lineages that might distinguish religion from spirituality. Again, these are fairly complex and overlap with one another. And finally, I think it's important whether one belongs to a religion or adheres to a type of spirituality to take note of the narratives, rituals, and traditions that might be common in both religion and spirituality. So, the upshot of this is that these categories are not mutually exclusive. It might be important in terms of surveys and perhaps some legal documents, but it's really important, I think, mostly to kind of ask questions and understand when someone identifies as religious or spiritual, what that actually entails. Another question that came up in the questions was, how can healthcare systems navigate a plurality of belief systems when developing healthcare policy? And this is a fantastic question, of course, because many of us live in communities where we do have a plurality of belief systems, not just amongst the patient body, but also perhaps in the caregivers and in the institutions. And so there are a couple of ways in which scholars of biomedical ethics have tried to navigate this. Some people have forwarded, for example, a virtue approach where they want to ensure that healthcare systems and healthcare providers within that, you know, possess a type of virtue or kind of the habituation of certain um, um, practices and beliefs in line with the larger community. However, this is not easily done because virtues can be very specific to a particular community. Another approach that I'm going to be talking about, and one that is quite common, is the principles-based approach. And I think that this is considered to be one of the most common ways in which medical students in the United States are educated in biomedical ethics. Let's see. And this is called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. There is a book that I believe is now in its eighth edition. When I was a student of Jim Childress, who is pictured here on the left, and Professor Goldstein here was also a student of Jim Childress over at UVA, and Tom Beecham, who's a philosopher. When they wrote the principles of biomedical ethics, they wrote this text and developed it in the context of a pluralistic society. And so the principles themselves do not come out of any obvious religious tradition, but I think it's important to note that both Childress and Beecham met while they were students at Yale Divinity School. And Professor Childress continued to teach his entire life in a department of religious studies. The principles of biomedical ethics are generally considered to be respect for patient autonomy, non-maleficence, or commonly understood as do no harm, beneficence, which is to do good, justice, and possibly utility and community. And these are two principles that are discussed kind of on the margins, but nonetheless might be considered candidates for future principles. And the idea behind the principles of biomedical ethics is that they can be considered by both caregivers and physicians and healthcare workers as well as patients, right? In terms of trying to adjudicate which values are most important when we think about dilemmas that arise in medical settings. Some of the influences that went into developing the principles of biomedical ethics were the notion of a common morality. So, what do people and what do communities have in common? Um, Another huge influence was the philosophy of John Rawls, whose famous theory of justice talks about developing a set of norms that might come about when the people who are developing those norms are hidden behind what he refers to as a veil of ignorance. So if you did not know who you were, and if you did not know the people that you were developing these norms for, what would be the fairest set of rules that you could come up with that don't benefit yourself, since you don't know your identity, and don't benefit specific groups? It's also, I think, important to note because we are human and creatures of our historical and cultural context, that there are certainly current events that had a major influence in developing principles. One of those is the civil rights movement, right? So the idea that people are to be respected for who they are and regardless of sex or gender. And also medical advances. At around this time, kidney transplantation, and this is an image of the first successful kidney transplantation that had taken place at Brigham Hospital in the 1950s, between where a twin brother donated his kidney to his other twin. And this was one of the major advances in medicine that led Beecham and Childress to try to develop a system of thinking through questions of justice. Who would have access to this type of life-saving technology, especially if it was difficult to come by because it was cost prohibitive? Question two, is another question that I pulled out of the reader, the people who signed up. They submitted. Question two is, how should clinicians respond when religious beliefs lead patients to refuse certain medical procedures or clinical trials? And this is a great question. And a related question to that is, can you share examples where a patient's religious or spiritual belief significantly influence the clinical care plan? And for to answer this question, right, I think what's most important is respect for patient autonomy, right? So if a healthcare believer holds on to certain values that contradict a patient, so long as that patient is deemed to be sound, rational, right? We're not talking about a patient who is, for example, incapacitated, right? So long as that patient is of sound mind, then clinicians actually have to respect a patient's autonomy and their ability to make decisions for themselves about their own bodies. Um, of course, there are some complications around the edges, but I think we can talk about that in the Q&A. And for an example, when a patient's religious or spiritual beliefs significantly influence the clinical care plan, this made me think of a, a personal case where a dear colleague of mine discovered that she had breast cancer while she was pregnant and determined, because of her deeply held Catholic beliefs, to continue with the pregnancy rather than treat the breast cancer. And so she remained at the hospital throughout the second and third trimesters of her pregnancy, delivered her child, and then died in the hospital because the breast cancer had metastasized. Um, and so this is a clear example of when this patient, right, who was a professor of religious ethics, so clearly of sound mind, who understood the um, the decision that she was making, it clearly had a major influence on the way in which her pregnancy and her cancer were going to progress. So there are other examples, of course, that many of us can think about, but that's one. And I'm going to close with a third question that was raised in by the audience. And that is, what are the ethical limits of provider conscientious objection in healthcare practice? So, one of the principles is beneficence, right? So that you have a type of moral obligation to do good for the patient. And translated practically, for example, in an emergent situation, um, a physician has to be able to stabilize a patient in an emergent situation. In a non-emergent situation, for example, a woman would like to have access to an abortion, and the healthcare provider finds that that procedure goes against his or her beliefs, then that physician has an obligation to then provide alternatives for that patient to seek an abortion. There are major complications, of course, because especially in situations like in rural environments or where patients are indigent, um, obviously having access to alternatives um, can be quite difficult. I have read other proposals that, for example, physicians who are entering into rural medicine should only go into that field, if they are willing to provide, um, certain procedures for the rural population, knowing the limits of that context. The flip side of that argument is that it is so difficult as it is to find physicians to provide care in rural settings um, that you know we cannot place those sorts of limitations on providers when hiring in a rural setting. And then finally, if we have time, we had talked about a contemporary case study and why it's so important to study religion and spirituality. And this case study has to do with vaccination. As we all know, measles cases are on the rise, and one of the major reasons why measles is on the rise is because parents are signing forms claiming religious exemptions to their children receiving measles vaccinations. So I will leave with that because I believe my time is up. And then I think that Professor Zoloth is up next. Thank you.
Okay, this is Professor Zoloth's turn. So you'll see that we're going to cover very similar ground because these are very important and central questions to our discipline. I just want to thank everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about religion and about bioethics, and to talk about them together is actually really an interesting and important topic. And I'm glad to see so many people are also interested in it. Why do we care about religion, though? Well, first of all, we care about religion in disciplines like philosophy and ethics because we care about reasoning. We care about arguments, how people make arguments, and how people make decisions. Bioethics, however, it aims at more than just describing how something is. My teacher, Karen LeBox, used to teach me never to say, don't just say, "Ah, gee whiz, ain't it awful?" You have to actually think about what that means, not just describe, but also suggest normative answers. And of course, normative answers are often provided in systems such as religion, because religion is a matter of norms and rules and laws and divine law and secular law. And the law is both secular and religious. I studied Jewish thought. Irene studies Islam. In those tradition, there's a deep sense that the law is divinely inspired and matters as a way to live one's life, a halakha, a mode in which one travels. Secondly, because we care about public access. This is a Hegelian concept, the notion of publicity of action. When you make an action, you have to be able to defend your action. Even action understood as completely private in secular society can be understood as part of who you are as a moral actor, as a part of a religious community. So bioethics thinks of that too. That's why we allow ourselves to think about things like abortion and private choices, because we do think that those things, while private choices are public actions and will affect society as a whole. And therefore, the relationship in bioethics is always more than just one to another. It always involves the gaze of the third. And therefore, all such relationships are ones of justice. They take place within a context in which there's scarcity of resources, in which there's scarcity of time, and therefore we need discursive reasons to justify choices. So the first question I want to take on is, why in a pluralistic society in which we know there's real differences around religion, do you need religious views in bioethics? Shouldn't we then, when you know there's division in different religions, why don't we devolve to the lowest common denominator, which is a null point, what has been called the view from nowhere? I'm going to give you answers why not. Religion's already there. Religion is very much in the public square, and that's not only true in America, it's true in country after country globally. There's debates about moral status, about abortion. There's debates about family formation, including funding for IVF or support for IVF or denial of IVF. There's questions about the use of marijuana and peyote in the service of ritual, debates about what we owe to illegal immigrants, public benefits that are not mandated, what do we owe to the stranger, minimum wages, and debates about just income can be seen as turn into religious debates. Mendocino County in California voted to be GMO-free because of purity, a debate about purity. Medical assistance in dying is debated as morally acceptable or not, another fundamentally religious question. And finally, how you treat the stranger at your door, the big debates around abortion that are such central debates in America today are religious debates. So religion's already there. It's not like there is some place in which we can just be tolerant of everything and not religious. Religion is already a deep part of the way we think about ourselves as public humans. And there's a lot of religion currently, the funding for NIH projects and for faith-based responses to healthcare-related issues like addiction, homelessness. Supreme Court justice selection in the United States, the teaching of evolution, the selection of science textbooks at the local and school board level, the placement of, for instance, one version of the Ten Commandments in public schools. So again, religion is very much a part of how we think about what it means to make an argument in the public square. So why we need it? The first answer comes because a pluralistic society needs another voice. And religion holds some of the lost language of justice that isn't available in Rawls and isn't available in analytic philosophy. And a reason to care for the poor and for the vulnerable and for the hopeless person is part of religious responses. And that's why religion is needed, because religious bioethics thinks about how societies not only survive, but prevail, that looks for the nature of the goal and the meaning of all of its moral activities and its moral economies. The core narratives of religious bioethics deal with bands and beliefs and beneficence, with covenants and empathy, as well as disobedience and disgust and disgrace. Again, topics that are fully considered in religion and in narratives of religion, but not really a part of analytic philosophy. The core narratives of religious bioethics deal with sacrifice, betrayal, sanctuaries, sacrilege, shame and revenge, guilt and atonements, all of which come to play when we actually discuss a case, right? These are all the human ways of facing crisis, and they all come into play, and they all have to be considered. And therefore, when we really fully give a thick description of cases, religious reasons come to the fore. The core narratives of religious bioethics deal with miracles and with magic, with divine and human forms of suffering, and with all kinds of yearning and desire. And when patients turn to us and make an argument in the name of miracle or the name of magic, we need to know what that's about. We need to know how important that is fundamentally to ideas about faith, spirituality, fidelity. Right. Also, religion is where we think about suffering, and where suffering has a meaning beyond that of just a thing to be, an illness to be obliterated. But suffering itself can bring meaning to people, and that's such an odd and paradoxical idea that's really only understood in the context of religious theory. Religious bioethics is nurtured by divine absolutes and of command. And sometimes we find that startling when someone, like in the case that Professor O described to us, feels they are commanded not to have an abortion because of divine law. It can be very puzzling and troubling to healthcare providers who are, by and large, statistically, tend to be less religious or less commanded than patients, by and large, studies tell us. But religious bioethics pays attention to those demands and attention to those divine absolutes. And the third answer is religious bioethics sanctifies human life, not just wants it to exist, but sees it as something that is in fact sacred and adds a dimension of sacrality to our discussions about why a life might be important, even if it's not productive or even if it's not utility, it has a low utility value. The fourth answer is religious bioethics is both utopian and quotidian. It's both an ethics for the interim, for right now, how we live now, but it also carries an eschatological component, a telos. We not only have to cope with the healthcare that we face now and the dilemmas that we face now, but we want to think about the future. We want to think about the question of hope. And that's an eschatological question. And for many of our patients, they're thinking already in the future, the already not now. They're thinking of a life beyond this life, for instance. And that's something that only religion really and religious bioethics take on in a serious manner. The religion brings the utopian into the world, and this comes from the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, who talked about law as an example of what we want to happen in an ideal world. It creates space, following a religious law, creates a space for what the world might look like if nobody murdered, nobody stole, everyone stopped at stop signs. It's an aspirational goal. And so working within this creates a kind of agency for healthcare providers and for patients in which they're capable of thinking beyond their particular situation, that they can hope beyond hope, for instance. The fifth answer is that religious bioethics insists on both the sacredness as well as the imperfection of human life and of biology itself, or the biological life itself, the indeterminacy of answers. That's why we have laws that cut against the indeterminacy of biological processes, and that's why we can have a religious discussion about when life begins and when life ends in a way that really can't be answered or can't be considered within the frameworks of secular ethics or even modern medicine or science. These questions that are not scientific are really the ones that religious bioethics is most concerned with. And this notion of imperfection and failure, that's a deep part of what it means to think theologically, the absence of God, the failure of the community, the failure of faith, the lack of fidelity, the sense of can one trust one another. Those are the subjects of religious bioethics. The sixth answer is religious bioethics insists that atonement is as important a motivation for moral action as is autonomy. The idea that you can make a mistake and then make up for it, that you can live a life of sin, for instance, and still it's possible to return, to atone, to begin life anew, for second chances, a deep idea about second chances. The seventh answer is that religious bioethics reminds us that humans, also in their moral motivations, are actually more than rational creatures, that our beliefs and our yearnings and our emotional hopes and our aspiration also play a role in the act and therefore should play a role in our reasoning itself. The eighth answer is that religious bioethics insists on speaking truth to power. And there used to be many such systems like this, but religious bioethics is fundamental. The Exodus story, speaking truth to Pharaoh, the story of Jesus's life and his journeys, speaking truth to power, all of these narratives again and again talk about how you address power, what you do with power, how you turn from power, how you take power, and how you speak truth to power. The ninth answer is that religious bioethics aims at enhancing the invisible lives of moral strangers. Emmanuel Levinas reminds us that we can never really know the life of the other. We can really never know the other. The other is not a possession for us. We can never have the life of another. We can only be in our life and know that the stranger's life is invisible but important. And religious bioethics aims at looking at that and saying, this invisible life, the one that's beyond being a patient, that has to do with their faith community or their faith commitments, is important for us. And religion lifts that up and enhances that. The 10th answer is religious bioethics keeps reminding us about the intrinsic opacity of the moral terrain of human deliberation. We are, again, more than just a bundle of rights, as we are in law, in legal theory. We are opaque to one another, and therefore sometimes our commitments, and one of the questions that's already come up, what do you do when someone just insists that they want to do something because of their faith commitment? It can be opaque to us, and yet we can still honor it. Second question, okay, if we do all those things, what do we do when religious values are in tension with secular values that we also hold dear and we also think are important, like what we call that Georgetown mantra, right? Autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. What happens when it seems that people are acting in tension with these values? And that's oftentimes not only a value question, it's an epistemic crisis. It's how do we know? So Immanuel Kant asks these three questions. He asks, right, how can I know? What must I do? For what can I do? What ought I to do? And finally, for what can I hope? Right? So this epistemic crisis also comes into play. How can I know? What do we do when people believe things that we think just are not true, right? And most fundamentally, this has come down around the discourse around vaccinations. The debate about vaccinations reveals a fundamental lack of trust of secular expertise and really has to do with the question of whose law matters. This idea of law as existing in the secular realm and also law as existing in the divine realm, as having a divine realm, raises questions about whose law will really matter when it comes down to it. And as a scholar of bioethics, I was asked to adjudicate in cases in COVID when people were faced with mandatory vaccine requirements to continue work, or entrance into certain locations or entrance to certain goods and services, and primarily working as healthcare workers, whose people would come forward and say, but my religious law says I can't do this. How is that adjudicated? And it became a question of, trying to sort out the epistemic realities, what was true, what facts we could agree on, and then coming down to whose law would really matter. And would people, when we came to disagreement, be willing to take the consequences for being a minority in a majority society that had agreed that there was a public good for vaccination? one of the questions that came up it was, what do you do if someone wants to act foolishly, and you think of them as having a foolish action or a self-harming action if their autonomy makes a bad decision. And saying someone has autonomy doesn't mean you don't argue against it or use every tool in your toolkit to provide moral suasion. And one of the tools in our toolkit is up against religious reasons is the very powerful religions of science. And often there we'll disagree, right? Caring about religion means caring about it enough to respect the disagreement and to then have it and seriously contend with it rather than dismissing it. The law in question is always religious in these cases. It's an example of a command, it's a category, and it's about the limit of state power over the body, especially the body of children in the case of vaccination. It's also an example of how the concept of naturalness that sometimes stands in for sacredness in secular societies has made such an important a play in our contemporary world. Oftentimes people say, I am not religious, but I am spiritual, and then turn to ideas of naturalness or polytheism, or this notion of that there's a sacredness to nature itself, and because there's a sacredness or a spirituality in nature, that's actually a religious argument held up against the science argument, though it's not technically religious. It has a sort of pagan quality, the notion that one is naturally able to have a child without medical intervention, or naturally able to have one's immune system resist COVID. That stands in for what in earlier historical periods would have been a religious rule. There's confusion here about, for instance, in vaccination, about the stem cell lines, about the lines that we use for research. Are they stem cell? Are they human embryonic stem cell lines? Are they established tissue culture lines? Clarifying that was the first step. That's what I meant about the epistemic confusion that has to precede the values discussion. And that's because the abortion debate was so deeply important in American public life and in Christian life that it colored the way people thought about research itself. Currently, the abortion debate has shifted into the debate about research. Human tissue research is now being curtailed and unfunded at the federal level in the United States of America. So you can't use any tissue that was any fetal tissue research. That cuts off an important piece of basic science research. And there's a religious debate about whether, from the community that would, I think, define itself as spiritually attentive to the situation for the positionality of animals, about the use of animals in research. And both of these are surrogates for ways of thinking about the moral agent relative to the divine. So I want to thank most particularly John Helge Solbach, whose ideas about religion and bioethics have deeply influenced the way I think about it at the University of Oslo. And then my colleagues, Krista Train and Dina Davis, the late Justin Engelhardt, Bob Gibbs, and Stephen Kepnes, who also helped me think through some of these ideas that I could share with you today. So thank you. And questions? We'd like to turn to your questions and then just have an open discussion between Professor O and myself about what we think about this.
I'm so excited to have you both here today. Again, I'm Melissa Goldstein. I'm in the School of Public Health at GW. And I thought one of you might have a question for the other or something that you'd like to discuss first. If not, I'll head into the questions we've gotten and some of my own, actually.
Well, we've had a lot of time to talk. So
okay, all right. So
it's your turn.
What I'd like to start with is, I am a lawyer and a bioethicist, and I have seen in courts, particularly in the vaccination area and required vaccinations by any states, which of course have changed over the past few years from what we have traditionally seen, in states where religious exemptions from vaccine requirements are allowed, particularly in school requirements, right? For kids to go to school or preschool, any level of school, is a struggle among courts and people that are in these decisions in school districts and parents about what actually qualifies as a religious exemption, what actually qualifies as a real bona fide religion. I've seen that language in a lot of court cases. How would you recommend, really, that states and school systems and parents actually address the question of what actually counts as a religion?
So, I was just reading about a failed attempt in the South Carolina state legislature to get rid of the religious exemption for vaccination in school children. There will always be a medical exemption. There are some children who obviously have medical terrible reactions to vaccines, and those children will always be exempt. Um, but truthfully speaking, I think that the religious exemption should not be allowed because of what you just said, Melissa. It is impossible to adjudicate what counts as religion or what counts as a deeply held spiritual belief. And vaccination is so interesting from a biomedical ethics perspective because, unlike other medical decisions, so much hinges on the effectiveness of herd immunity. So, and so my truthful, very frank opinion is that religious exemptions should not exist.
I really agree, especially for all of those reasons, especially because it has to do with whether you see yourself as an individual moral agent, or you and your family are more important than other people and the laws don't really apply to you, or whether you see yourself as part of a living community whose children, the children of strangers matter to you as much as your own children, or they would take account in the lives of strangers in any way. And we need that to work as a society, right? So it goes to the fundamental heart of what it means to be in a democracy and to work together as a society versus just being out there in the woods alone on some level. I do think that we've encountered a lot of different religions. There was Wiccans, there was pagans, there was all varieties of Christianity, all varieties of Catholicism, and I have to say that there was a few even in the Jewish community before that got figured out, who resisted it mightily as well. And it was odd because traditionally within Judaism, Islam, and both communities typically embraced technology and medicine in a full and thoroughgoing way. Interestingly enough, in Native American communities had very high take-up of the vaccines for COVID. So it wasn't directly correlative to one's notion of the spiritual naturalness, but there was such a chaos of reasons that you have to either make a decision as a state that you're going to go for the health of children because of herd immunity or not. And I agree with Irene that it should just be. That's the basis of medical determination. And you don't have to be part of a state if you don't want to. If you really feel strongly enough about it, then okay, then you're out there and you lose some protections. But that should be. We need to get a handle of this because the measles epidemic could easily go quite out of control, and then it really negatively affects the most vulnerable children, the medically fragile children who need the herd immunity to keep safe, who can't take a vaccine. Those are the people who we have to defend. That's who we should be thinking about.
Thank you both. I think the public health community should be calling on you to give advice when state legislatures are thinking about revising their laws, which a lot of them are right now. And it may be going in different directions, actually. So different states, different directions. The second,
I want to
go
say
ahead.
one thing here. Notice that the epistemic, the thing about what was true and not true is tick this off. No one had these religious objections, from the 17th through the 20th century. It took this notion that vaccines were bad for you. Mercury was bad for you. It was in the vaccine, and mercury caused autism. It took that report and the hunger for people to have an explanation for having a child with on the autism spectrum. It took the fact that we don't really know what causes cognitive or mental illness. We just don't know. And so, and because the initial explanation was it's mommy's fault, right? And people were so desperate not to tell that. So that notice that the confusion and the mistrust of expertise begins with an epistemic problem. And then the name given to that, to the objection to it, becomes religious and then finally political in our time.
Thank you. This is such a rich discussion. In many of the Q&A that people have put on today, and thank you, and please keep them coming. And if we're not able to get to your questions during this discussion, we'll send them to the panelists and so that they can answer them separately. Another one that I wanted to address, both questions that we got before the session and questions today, is that the issues of translating the ideas that we've discussed today to the actual clinical environment, both in the idea of healthcare providers and what they feel like they should be able to do or not be able to do with their different religions, but also in advising patients. How do we translate the idea of religious ethics, training and discussions and thought into the clinical ethics realm and working with actual patients and providers? How do you advise, I guess, clinicians on how to do this?
Well, Dina Davis offered something really interesting decades ago about thinking about thick description in bioethics cases. So she's done. She did a great service to the field by bringing that concept in. Too often when we do case discussions, case narratives, and discuss them, we strip them of their important rich details. What's the race and ethnicity? Who do you believe? Who do you trust? Who do you trust? So remembering always to ask those questions, and being able to call on expertise when you need it, right? But it really does matter what kind, if the person is religious and how they define religion and who their authorities are, who their religious authorities are, or their texts are that animate their discussions, what they believe in their family. And if that question isn't asked, and you're just dealing with the medical question, you are often going to have a catastrophic failure in bioethics and end up with you, Professor Goldstein, in court.
So, understanding the very real time constraints that clinicians have, in healthcare settings, right? They don't have the luxury of learning all about a particular religious tradition. I tell my Religion 1003 Intro to World Religion students, you need to know enough to know where to go for more help.
Right.
And no one is expecting a physician or nurse or a caregiver to become an expert in religious tradition. And in fact, even scholars of religion don't pretend to know about multiple religious traditions. But I think that to know enough to know that you need to dig further and where you might go for that is what's really important. Sometimes religious, beliefs have a huge impact and sometimes they don't. Um, and so it's important, I think, to is kind of establish a foundation, right? Is this something that I need to learn more about? And if so, where do I go for help? And that's key.
Wonderful, wonderful thought. Lori, did you have more to add?
Oh, just oftentimes
Yeah.
religion is seen as pathology, right? It's seen as like an evidence that they don't understand something, or that they're poorly educated, or that they just must be nuts, right? And that's always, don't go down that road, doctor. So that's because that's something to really, again, you have to really, to respect autonomy means to really respect another person's deepest beliefs and values. And there's a phenomenon called the generalization of expertise. Because you're a really smart scholar of medicine, or you really are a wonderful doctor, your expertise does not extend to knowing the values of another family. And in fact, they're the expert in their own value system. Right? So while and certainly they're the expert in their own religious system, unless you share their belief structure, while your expertise can be considerable and profound and important, but you can't generalize it to knowing everything about everything. And they may know more things about themselves, their bodies and their choices than you can know. And so having some humility when you approach someone in the clinic is really critical.
That's very helpful. Have you seen good paradigms of this, where there are people available? I guess we would call them clergy, or we would call them advisors or pastoral advisors within hospitals. Have you seen availability? Does it tend to be only the rich hospitals, the rich, communities that have these people, or are they more widely available for
Well,
consult?
there's the Jehovah's Witnesses are a really interesting case where the Jehovah's Witnesses have a liaison, so that Jehovah's Witnesses can reach out to the Jehovah's Witness liaison. They know especially in the big university hospitals in the cities, but actually everywhere, you can reach someone who knows medicine, has expertise, knows the resources for a Jehovah's Witness family, and can adjudicate that very, very common debate about blood transfusion. So that's one thing that people should know about. Call the Jehovah's Witness liaison when you're dealing with a Jehovah's Witness refusing blood, and that's true for Jews and for Catholics. There are established structures, and then of course there's CPE trained chaplains in many hospitals around America and in other countries as well. I was recently working on a project with colleagues in Georgetown looking at the issue of trust in healthcare. And a colleague from Sri Lanka talked about how in Sri Lanka, the traditional Ayurveda healers and the doctors work together across schools of medicine. So it is possible in different parts of the world to work together with traditional healers and osteopathic doctors and medically trained doctors can work together. We've seen there's multiple examples of that throughout the world. So it is possible to do that. Certainly should.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the expansion of chaplains in hospitals to include multiple religious traditions is hugely helpful. I will say, though, that structurally, the way, for example, even teaching hospitals within large universities are established, it is very hard sometimes to break through those silo walls and reach out to someone, in a different college or a different department to say, hey, this came up. Is this something that we can discuss? And that is something that I think structurally needs to be incentivized.
Right. Yeah.
I agree. I have participated in clinical consults, and we have used the Jehovah's Witness liaison actually at the GW Hospital Ethics Committee, but it wasn't always that way, right? And it's not always that way with the multiplicity of religions, right? That we have educators like that. So I agree with both of you and really appreciate you both coming today. As you can see, we've got lots of
So many
questions coming in
questions.
as we go, but
Yeah.
that's great. You have raised interest among everyone, and we really appreciate it. I only want to note that GW students who are looking for professional enhancement activity, there's the email in the chat that you should email to. And thank you both on behalf of me and Paul. I know Paul's out there somewhere for coming today, especially. Well, not especially, but Lori, thank you for coming, especially during your sabbatical. And Irene, I hope to get to see you again soon on campus. Paul, we're very lucky to have you both today.
I want to say that we're really lucky. Look at their smart participants with these wonderful and really important questions. I urge you all to take a look at the questions. They should be published along with this event because they're really thoughtful questions. So I thank you for the questions. They're giving me something to think about too. Just beautiful questions about suffering, about the complexities. I wish we had time to answer every single one.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been great, extremely well run, but too short.
Yeah. Right.
Really love talking to you, Lori. And Melissa, let's catch up.
Would love to.
Good.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Aval.
Take
Be
care.
well.
Thank
Bye.
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
And bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.